All right, everybody. So I guess we'll go ahead and get started. So this is week 5 of our Money Talk series. Thanks everybody for coming this morning and for coming throughout the week. It's been interesting. We started off with an introduction as to what we're doing, what are our goals, what's the purpose of this. We had 3 teachers here, John David, Tom Longenecker, and Christina Bucher, who led us in a study on the Gospel of Luke through a curriculum efforts, and also what they bring to the table as far as the Chris dealt with what do we value, and had a lot of the woes in there. John David is helping others and helping self, and last week was the perplexing parables by Tom Longenecker, which is all 3 very informative, and I hope you all enjoyed it. So we decided that we were going to bring the teachers back and kind of like pick their brains a little bit as far as what they discovered. I know that when I teach Sunday school, I learn a lot by just preparing for the Sunday school class. So we thought it'd be interesting to hear their perspectives on what they learned. We have a couple of questions that we submitted to them, so they're prepared to answer those. But this is a dialogue back and forth. We'll have time where we would like to hear if you have any questions as well. So it's going to be very much an open forum, but we'll start it off with the first question. So, what did you learn by preparing to teach your class, or what did you learn from the class session itself? Anybody want to start?
I have a memory issue. Do you have the list of the Everett's text that we did? I need a memory jogger.
I will be.
I think one of the things that struck me most profoundly was the one on the supposed wicked servant, also called the shrewd servant, which I think is a better term for it now that I've gotten some enlightenment. And that one got me really rather excited, because I've always struggled with the passage. It's the one where the servant, the steward of a wealthy man who had a lot of people who were not paying him, decided he would get the money, but he wouldn't get it all. So he went around and said, well, I'll tell you what, you $100, you give me 50, we'll call it square. And he went through one after another. You may remember that. And it's labeled in at least one of the Bibles that I had as the wicked servant. And so I read it with the eyes that this is a wicked servant. Had it been a shrewd servant, I would have read it through different eyes. Because all of a sudden I began to, both in some of my commentary work and also in your leading us through it, I began to see this person as, yeah, this person is being shrewd. He's realizing you got a bunch of deadbeats out there who aren't paying their bill. But if he makes them think they got a bargain, they'll pay up pretty quick. And so he gets his employer money, not as much as his employer wanted, but at least he got some money. He got people to start paying. And in the process, he put himself in good standing with the other people who normally, because he is the one who is the bill collector, would normally always be seen as someone you want to avoid. All of a sudden, he gets seen in more favorable light because he's on their side. So in a way, everyone comes out of that as either a winner or a partial winner. I mean, granted, the man who loaned the money out isn't a full winner, but he has more than he would have had otherwise. So I look at that as now all of a sudden I look at that and I say, okay, I can see why this guy is being praised. I could never see it when he was simply squandering his employer's money. I thought, well, why would you praise that? But all of a sudden it's like, oh, okay. Well, when I think about that in light of what we're supposed to be about, That has to do with a person who has an element of shrewdness about how to manage money and how to make the most of what you've got. And I think back to those who worked really hard to create the kind of endowment process. I mean, when that got started, there was a lot of opposition to it, as I've heard from some who were in that process, who worked so hard to set it up for us. And it served us very well for a long time. Now we have far more money in that than we did at first. And the economic situation is different, both in terms of the level of our giving and also in the level of how money is managed. The shrewdness that was used to create something new against all odds at one time might still be the best way to go, but it might be there's a better way to look at it. And so I see that as now our attempt to follow the pattern of the shrewd servant, as beginning to say, okay, maybe we need to take a look. But now the problem is, well, I have a modicum of shrewdness when it comes to looking at biblical texts. I have almost none at looking at financial planning. So that's as far as I can go with that. But that's what I learned, I'd say, from this whole problem. That really stands out as a real discovery.
Can I follow up on that?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So there's some people who say, you said the wealthy man with all the money who doesn't get as much back in terms of repayment, is partially, I forget how you put it, is maybe
Partially satisfied.
partially satisfied. There's some people who say that what he likes is now the people he's loaned to think more highly of him.
Yeah, well, that's true. Okay, so he got a boost in honor.
Yes, you got a boost in honor, and so I think if you're going to apply it to the church situation, a lot of people look at church, the institutional church, and think, oh, they have so much wealth. So they might look at this church and say, wow, what a big building and so impressive and all of that. But what are they doing for us?
And then when they hear how many millions we have in escrow, wow,
Yeah.
do they really need any more?
So that, I think, even
Honor,
the
yeah,
honor issue, I think, even strengthens that kind of.
thank you. I had, and I've been fascinated by the role of honor in the first century, how important that was. Of course. Thank you. I got another new learning. This is wonderful. It is great.
So we both learned from your session.
That's it. I really appreciate that. That's so I'm not actually that aware of the kind of the bigger question that we're all looking at. So I was really just kind of moving into the text. So I think that's a really good way. The term I couldn't remember last week is Chet Myers is really more of a Mark scholar, referred to this as the defective steward. Okay, now that's not offensive. Okay, but he's referring to as he's both defective as a steward and he's also defecting from the system of oppression, because it's known that the landlord, the master, would have to charge exorbitant interest, or actually, yeah, not really interest, because the interest and the principal kind of get mingled or merged, so you couldn't really figure out what was what. But one of the things that in Myers' perspective is that the steward is somebody who's defecting in place. I think maybe that's actually more my term, but he's critiquing and pointing out the defective system, which is death dealing, and also highlighting that he is defecting and kind of putting himself at the mercy of kind of the koinonia, the household system of care and hospitality outside of the system that is based on oppression and just inequality between the classes.
Cool. Any thoughts from the audience? We'll move on. So,
Well, I wouldn't even heard what good things they've learned yet.
I'd love to hear.
But go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to stop.
So the second question is, what scriptures of the passage from the last 3 weeks do you find the most challenging, or which scriptures make you uncomfortable?
Well, I'll just say the Beatitudes and woes. have always made me uncomfortable. I think it's the directness, woe to you who are rich, and wondering, well, you know, how rich is rich? We've talked about that in past sessions. We're in the 1%. If we look globally, we're probably not in the 1% in the US, but certainly globally, we're in the 1%. What does that mean? So I think the Beatitudes and woes, and I think that for me is the summarizes Luke's understanding of wealth. And I think it's used, as I said earlier, I think it's used kind of rhetorically to get people's attention. So it's gotten my attention, and I continue to struggle with what it means for me personally, and now in this conversation, what it means for us as a congregation.
Yeah, I wish they'd have talked to me first before they wrote that.
Yes.
I have a thought. Tom said something about koinonia. And that's a communal, is that right? I'm thinking of, well, I'm gonna throw it out. What would happen if we, would be like River Place Fellowship, where there was a communal, and that was so communal, Brother Mennonite. And we put all of our resources into a pot. I know this is far out, and each one of us would get a share. All our resources, our personal resources, would go into a pot. And then each of us in the congregation would have a share, would get a share out of that. But we couldn't keep our personal finances for ourselves. It's just way out there. And I'm thinking of our endowment in those terms of setting up something that will be shared with those who are with all of us.
Yeah, I don't know about does anyone know about the community that, yeah.
Could you explain that more? I know about it, my brother-in-law was in it, so
He was like the lead elder.
it was like,
Wasn't he like the lead elder at River Place?
yes, they had several elders for that.
It was, yeah. When I was in seminary, I was kind of associated. Speak a little louder, please. River Place is a community, once was dual affiliated Mennonite and Brethren. I think they're just now Mennonite. It was just difficult to maintain the connections to both denominational structures. It started in the 50s, I think, through a Mennonite volunteer service unit, and then developed kind of out of a common purse, where the entire congregation lived out of a common purse. Eventually, they broke that, so they had a common purse section and then a fellowship section. But a lot of the focus was racial integration and economic sharing. I'm not sure that there's.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean,
I did a study there, and I know that one man spoke about how he taught sociology at a local college, and he said that, he would let it slide weeks before he'd go to the church office to pick up their stipend for their family. And so he felt as if he was slacking in his own kind of responsibilities to his family because everything was taken care of. And so that family actually had left the common purse, became part of the fellowship later on. So yeah, that's been an ongoing experiment for about 70 years now, I guess.
my brother-in-law was.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, that's neither here nor there. And I appreciate somebody else doing that from the outside. But I do know they were beginning, the leadership really came down hard on, person, for example, my sister-in-law wanted, she had traveled to Europe and something, I don't know, Germany, and she wanted a camera, and she came, to take pictures, and she, of Germany, and she came to whoever was the leader of their household and asked if she could buy a camera, and they denied it. So to me, that was a little harsh, that was being.
I think one of the things I took from just particularly the passage you referred to is the contrast between two different kind of economies. One is about debt and wealth and accumulation or lack of accumulation. And then the other is kind of the ongoing hospitality system of the households. So I think that's something that I think is maybe kind of raised up here. Just last week, Chris and I, maybe you want to talk more about it, is that in Acts, it actually talks about kind of, we look at Acts and we think about everybody putting everything in common. But that's actually not necessarily, it's not quite that rigid. There was actually much more flexibility.
Well, I think if we look, there are certain passages you look at, Acts 2 and 4, for example, and you say, oh, we ought to do Riva Place. That's the model. But there are other models. If you look at the rest of Acts, which was written by the same author as Luke's Gospel, there are other models. So there are individuals like Lydia or Phoebe who are patrons. And there are examples in the gospel of individuals. I mentioned the first week in Luke 8, the 3 women who support the ministry. So there are other models for how you share well, other than the one which is which is a really, some people choose, but it's a really hard model to follow. I think it's not, I don't think it's an either or. Either we don't do anything or we form Riva Place. I think there are other possibilities.
There's an intermediate step that has been talked about in this church for many years, for decades. And Ray just brought it up to me a week or two ago. And that is, instead of everybody putting everything in the pot, how about if everybody tithes? And I'm not even sure we've got to that step yet. I don't know that it's fair to think get the whole way to everything in the pot without forming the wall first and tithing.
Point.
Somebody last week referred to the LDS church, I forget who that was. And one of the things is, you're not gonna go without if you're Mormon or if you're involved in your stake. The Acts text basically said nobody was without. Now I think that's much more complicated when you actually work. Some people apparently died. Okay, some relationships died in that because of lack of honesty. But I think that's one of the things that I would pick up is the sense of hospitality culture. Nobody is without. I think it's much more complicated because there are questions of who's taking too much, and who's and that kind of power differential. But I think that is one of the things I picked up through across some of these things.
I like being reminded of the hospitality process. And I think that's part of what our church has gone into most is striving to be ever more hospitable. And the challenge often has come when we have tried to help someone in a lower income bracket. And then those of us who are more financially comfortable, sometimes I hear questioning about, well, but how much do we do this? And is this really necessary? And that's where it becomes the ouch point, is when we begin to second guess our effort to be hospitable. But on the other hand, that's also part of the shrewdness, and that is being wise in the process. So how to find a way where hospitality wins generally, but shrewdness is not lost. Another text that comes to my mind as one that is troublesome is the one I probably spent the most time on in the presentation process. It has to do with the Samaritan. That has to do with what I heard spoken about from the rest of you all in challenging it to a degree. And that has to do with the risk level. How willing are we to risk? And that's where I find myself challenged, particularly at this stage in my life, when I fall into the classic syndrome of, oh, but I don't know how long I'll live and how much I'll need in order to, yeah, you know where the rest of it goes. I mean, I look at that on the one hand, and I think that's a serious and honest issue. On the other hand, I say, no, wait a minute. How hard have I really gotten into looking at the likelihood of my life and how much money I would really need? And are Sharon and I still having more in reserve than we really need to see us through? I mean, it's a troubling thing, but the question really underneath it isn't how much money do I need? The real question is, when I look at the story of the Samaritan, how much am I willing to risk? When I begin to raise my yes, but, that's when I'm showing my hesitancy to risk.
Now, David, can you mitigate that hesitancy or that risk by saying, okay, I'm going to keep some in reserve, and then when I don't need it anymore, it'll go back into the pot? That,
Sure, put it in my will, that if I haven't spent it at that point, then it goes in. Yeah, that would be a helpful thing. It doesn't help me deal with my willingness to risk.
yeah,
I still have to come to grips with that, I think.
What about living at poverty level? I know. You know, really, they chose to live at poverty level. And is that simple living? No, it's denial of good things, but they didn't know. It was one of those lovely houses on the street. Anyway. But they had a house full. And, sure, I like living in a household, but that has to be reined in. I mean, my independence is reined in also. I mean, on my part.
I think you raised a really good question.
Yeah.
The issue of
What is the problem?
it doesn't matter how much money do I have, how much do I really need to spend?
Simple living.
Yes.
I come back to simple living.
Yeah, Anime, you brought that up in the first week, what is simple living, which is a good question. And it's all, the way that I kind of view it is it's really, everybody would have many different answers. It's a different answer for everyone. And even individually, that person is going to have multiple answers even for themselves. But it's a worthwhile question. And it's definitely something to think about. What is simple living? What does that mean to us? How do we act it out? So it's a good question. Did we get through all the challenges? Yeah.
I was gonna say, a follow up on that. If you say each person's gonna have multiple answers to the same question.
Right.
But if we each look at each decision we make, is this simple?
Right.
Not just a broad kind of thing, but each purchase we make or each gift that we give or whatever it is this simple?
Does it mean that I have in my wardrobe, a top that I've had for more than 7 years? It's still good, it's wearable. Should I throw that out?
No, give it to Goodwill. So,
I think that would be my entire wardrobe. But
To be able to put the discussion about simple living kind of in the context of the congregational discussion that we're having.
Right.
Maybe, and kind of where I come down with this, I've had many close relatives that lived very austere lifestyles. So I have a lot of family background, and that mentality is there, and I don't question every dollar that is in their pocket. But I think where I'm at with it, and I think it can apply to our communal finances as well, is not think about in terms of simple living and how austere can we be, but let's think about intentional living. And make it, this is not necessarily, am I spending the correct amount on new clothes for myself? That I can live comfortably, feel good about myself, but not being another Marcos with 4,000 shoes in my closet. I mean, you can see some austerity in that, but really the question is not how harsh can I make my own creative conditions for the benefit of good, but really let's create intentional living in all the decisions we make, whether it's how we do something, when we do it, or how much we're spending.
right, you bring up a good point, Glenn, that the committee has kept, talked about, is that this is a congregational question. This is one body discerning this question, and to look at it individually. It's different than looking at it from okay, self. Now I have to involve all of you in it. It makes you think differently. So we can get through any of the challenges. Was there any challenges that we missed that you may have had?
I think the rich young ruler, that's not the part that's so challenging to me. It's Peter's response, well, we've given up everything, and then Jesus said, don't worry. Well, and that seems somewhat glib. And I do think I keep kind of coming back to you're casting yourself upon reliance upon one another, as opposed to kind of the imperative to give up everything. But it's not answered for me. It still hangs out there that I'm not sure how secure that promise Jesus kind of makes, how secure that promise is.
And maybe that's the issue. That brings us back to risk.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an uncomfortable space to be in, isn't it?
Luke purposely created so he wouldn't give you a guideline and kept it somewhat so that you will be pondering and thinking. Exactly.
I think the problem is we've had 2,000 years between then and now, and the total nature of economics has shifted. And so we live in a different culture, and the principles still remain. And that is the issue of, do we put our trust in God and in the community of faith that God has created, or do we seek to be independent? And that principle remains, but the implications shifts dramatically, in my opinion. What the rest of you?
Well, I think that's definitely part of it, the time period that's elapsed. But I do think that Luke leaves a lot of things open-ended, which is not that it doesn't matter, but that what matters is for you who are listening to the gospel or reading or discussing, that you think about it and think about what it means for your own lives together, or life. That I think a lot of it is open-ended, and we would love to have a formula, right? Like, okay, how much is
enough?
Where do I go off? And that isn't provided. I think it's challenging us, and the problem is too often we get immediately concerned that we might be in the woe rich, and so we don't want to really take up the discussion at all. It's easier just to ignore that and maybe turn to Matthew or Hard work.
Nancy doesn't give you a lot of help,
No.
actually.
Now, one thing I think is important is to realize Jesus was talking to poor people. And
Yes.
poor people today still here, they're at risk all the time. They never know when they're gonna have work. They never know, and they need to rely on each other, and that's why the poor give a great portion of their income to help people because they know they could be in that situation. Whereas we, in middle class, are taught to be self-sufficient and to have all the money and not worry about that. But for a majority of the people in the world, this is still very real. Life at risk. Well, why don't we buy insurance? They can't afford to buy insurance. And most people in the world. So we need to rethink this is real in our world today. Maybe we don't feel it because we're middle class and up. And but yeah, people in our communities and around the world, this is very much real. Life at risk.
And building on that, there are blessings that come from being in that situation of risk, choosing to not necessarily to not be sure where the provisions are going to come from if we take that road. There are blessings and provisions that come that we don't experience when we have everything all figured out ahead of time. There's community that happens that strengthens in that situation.
That is scary.
And I think getting back to what you're saying, group, not a definitive thing. And John David, you could probably, I was just in a program on, we're talking Hindu and Christianity, but the early founders, or there were a group of wealthy that supported the Bible, and then that changed over time. And then look at where we are 15 years later, where you don't have where families, you have generational, yes, more in the poor family. But then when we get old, who takes care of us? There is our families. I mean, I grew up on Long Island. We were within a half an hour of each other. Where we are now, I have one in California, I've got one in Vermont, Massachusetts, you know, none of us are close anymore. And I think some of that feeds into our needs. And like a friend of mine, her husband just went into nursing. That's $300 to $400 a day. So like John David, you're looking, I mean, Ken and I, we look at that, okay. What's paying that? And then if you figure, if you don't plan for that, then we are all paying for that because we, the government, is what pays Medicaid to all your nursing homes. And, you know, so I think like Luke leaving it open, maybe it was more like thinking, hey, this is how society is today, but who knows what it's going to be further out.
Thank you. Naomi, I saw you had a hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to introduce another word that I hear floating around in my head, and that word is trust. And I wonder when we talk about community, what the role of trust, whether we're talking nation or whether we're talking church, how that plays into risk and communitas and we can say we trust, but how deep does that go? I guess is what I'm probing.
When I would do premarital counseling, this always surprised me at first, but the session where they would bring their budgets, everybody would end up in tears. Not because they were talking about money, I never even knew what the amounts were, but because at the end of the day, really what they were talking about in the marriage, what you're doing is you're putting yourself in somebody else's hands. So it's really questions of intimacy and trust and risk, because we spend a lot of time working, and I'm really putting all of that in somebody else's hands. So I think the question, so much of this does come back to questions of trust and risk. Whether Luke intentionally or not wanted to those open-ended things, I think he certainly does. Or at least that's kind of the way I think we should focus. If we're going to get clear-cut answers, we're probably going to have to do a lot of mental gymnastics to kind of get clear-cut answers. I don't think they're there.
But I think some of the intention, or at least the way I think I like to see it work, yesterday, which last week, and even the last several weeks was, it does instigate, it does make people think, so you can have big ideas, right? But you know, but any idea is half baked at some point, it kind of depends when you take it out of the oven. You know, so we gotta start with that somewhere, but I think, you know, again, kind of the defective shrewd manager, he's not necessarily upending the whole system. He's trying to find ways of working in that system. And yeah, like, you know, 2,000 years later, our economics are very, very different. It would be depend on cash and other kinds of things in ways that it's unique, I think, in times of history to where we're at right now. So we can't just kind of like do a one-to-one correlation over. I think what some of the challenge is in the defective system, you know, how do we shrewd and make things workable? So the question you bring up is now that this is, I think there's still values we can pull from this, but the mechanics of it might be, you know, maybe not as simple as household structures, even though I think there's something in that kind of caring for one another, that trust and risk, which is still relevant.
I also like Glenn's word intentional.
Yeah.
Because the way simple living sometimes plays out is people spend a lot of money in order to look simple, to have simple dress, right? So I really like replacing simple living with intentional.
I can't take credit for it, that's great news.
Yeah.
Right.
I think in economic terms, we can look at supply and demand in the sense of the rich man and Lazarus. The supply is always obvious, the money that we have in the endowment. The demand, the poor people that they're pretty much invisible to us many times. And I think that we can see ourselves as the rich man ignoring Lazarus in many times when we think about our money. It's our money. And as far as what is enough, the shrewd manager obviously had knowledge of how to analyze the financial system at the time. And I think in our time, there are also analysts who could help us with what is enough for a nonprofit. I think there's some real guidelines, some specific guidelines but we have to look to the shrewdness, the analysts to help us with that. And that's the next step, I believe. And we can say where we want to go, but somebody has to help us with the mechanics, how we do it. And there are people that can help us with that.
Any other, we'll go on to question 3. How do the Lucan passages we have looked at the last 3 Sundays relate to the views of wealth in the larger context of the Bible? Do they conform with what is said elsewhere, or do they conflict with other views of wealth found in the Bible? Any conflict with any other areas?
I think, you know, Bible's filled with all kinds of contradictions and conflicts. And so it's a matter of which are the ones that Jesus picks up and the church picks up, and which ones are those they tend to critique.
I think there are a broad spectrum. You flag this even in Luke's portrayal of the early church. You have a fairly broad spectrum. You have the patron and client model, where the patron has the most money and provides the cash needed, and then the client then does a lot of work on behalf of the patron that gets the work done of the church. So you have that blending concept, and then you have the communal concept. The early church experiment isn't talked about later on, but they did try that, the reap-replace concept, and just like reap-replace modified itself. So did the early church. And so you have these various perspectives in the New Testament. But even throughout the Hebrew scriptures, you also find a variety of economic processes, I believe. I mean, you guys are stronger in that than I am, and that's why the prophets come along and say, now wait a minute, okay, why do you have that money? And where is your responsibility to the community? So those concepts of care for community, care for the least among us, is not new to the New Testament. It's a pervasive sense. Now, in terms of the economic systems and how they may have changed and how they may have dealt with their resources, there's a wide variety. So it's not so much conflict as it is, there are multiple ways to bring about this sense of sensitivity to caring for those who have the least. But within our tradition, we are pretty well following the teachings of Jesus, who's focused a lot more on the economics. I mean, he talks more about economics than probably anything else, and far more than he talks about sex, which I find fascinating because our church as a denomination has become hung up on sexuality, which I think is, are they not paying attention? They split as a church. I mean, how does this happen when the issues are economic and we focus on body parts? This is just crazy. I'm sorry, I got sidetracked.
Especially drawn back to when I was a child in World War II. We lived on a farm. And of course, family was all around at that point in time. And I said to my children, I said, you know, we were poor and didn't know it. At the time when World War II, there was rationing of sugar and butter, polio came out. And, but we always had something to eat. We always had meat. We always had a huge garden. We always preserved. So I never felt that we were poor, but I think in today's society, we were poor. Not poor in certain in spirit, but poor. And church was the focus of our family.
So just in the last generations, just in our cult, in our society, we've seen the economic systems shift around. And I think your story is like a lot of people probably say, you know, we weren't as dependent on cash. We didn't have a lot of that around. But if you're living on a farm or you're close to that kind of thing, things were taken care of, right? There's not the same kind of anxiety around that. Whereas our society is now like, has shifted different. And I'm not an economist. I don't understand much of that.
Yeah, I
There's always the sharecropper who didn't have a farm.
You got
They
that too.
worked somebody else's land and they may not have it. I mean, that's another here below, well, we own our farm. And if nothing else, we got the farm. If you're a sharecropper or living just by being a hired hand, that's another tier. And I think we forget the tier below, or we resent giving money to the tier below us, even when you're poor. So that's, but Jesus tried to lift him up. And even in, I guess, the Sojourners community, Jim Wallace always said, every budget is a moral budget. Shows the morality of our society by who gets and who receives and who is left out. And I think it's very important that if we look at the budget they're coming up with, we can continue. Who gets left out?
Yeah, I'll just add, there's not a single economy across the centuries that are reflected in the Bible either. So there are certain, at certain times in ancient Israel, when they're more like, Anna's family, they live off the land and they don't, and there is no cash. And then by the time of Jesus, there are people who don't have land and don't have cash and who are working for someone else and they don't have enough to support themselves. So the economy changes over the centuries as well. And I think maybe in Jesus' time, in some ways, it's closer to what we're experiencing now.
Yes, Glenn?
Not sure how closely related this comment is, but it kind of fits the kind of the change in the economy we're talking about here. And somebody earlier mentioned about tithing. You know, when you get to the tithing, like, well, 10% of what? Is that my pre-tax dollars? Is that my after deductions? Is that like after I take out all my food? And, you know, you all these caveats to it. And well, I'm retired now, so I really want a fixed income. And, you know, there's just a whole bunch of ways to get around that, think about it and struggle with it. A couple years ago, I asked a Muslim friend of mine, like, I forget the context of the conversation. I said, well, what do you do what is your responsibility to the church financially? And he said, well, the Muslims do have, instead of a percentage of your income, because that's so irrelevant in so much of today's economy. There's no, when back in biblical times, your income was what you had to spend for that year. There was no accumulated wealth. Well, what the Muslims do is by the end of each year, you're kind of expected to have given 2% of your net wealth to the church. So that accounts for all the money that you have stashed away in all the places that's earning you unearned income. I mean, that was like a whole new idea to me of how to think about, quote, tithing for the church is, let's not worry about where every little dollar comes from, but let's look at maybe what is our net worth and how much of that, we can think about that individually, or we can think about that corporately. This is our net worth with our church, or how this is what we have set aside. This is how much we have altogether. We don't have to worry about fluctuations in income month year to year. What is our net worth, and how much of that are we investing then in ourselves and then out into the community?
Yeah. Let's move on to question 4. We say that we are a community of people striving to follow Jesus by practicing peace, service, and openness to all. What connection can you draw between that statement and the Bible's view, or Jesus' view expressed in the Gospel of Luke, of wealth?
I'll start off this time. Yeah. Well, I think the one thing we haven't talked about, because we've been focused on scripture, is where we want to go as a congregation. And I think that's one piece that needs to come into this conversation. How are we going to use our wealth to make our mission statement as a congregation visible? And I brought along the messenger came. I'm not sure what they did with it. It's all banged up, but it's readable. The October messenger, and I really recommend Walt Wilczek's article, to boldly go. It's a strange new world for the church and its ministry, and it's not lengthy. It doesn't go into depth, but it does, I think, provoke us to think not how do we want to get back to what we had, but where is it we want to go, and how can we use our wealth to get there, to move us in that direction.
You know, some of the context for all of Luke is Luke 4. Jesus reads from Isaiah, and this kind of lays out some of the template for his ministry. And I think it's helpful to kind of go back to that passage sometimes when we're looking at these other passages. And there's reading from Isaiah, and part of that is I've come to proclaim good news, evangelize gospel for the poor. So in these passages, there's usually good news for the poor in these passages. I think one of the things is, what is gospel for the poor? That seems to be an ongoing. So when we talk about openness, okay, what does that mean to be open and be able to offer good news to those without? Or making peace.
I love it. I'm struck by by this concept that you're raising. And I write down, what is our good news for the poor of Elizabethtown? We cannot solve the problems of the world. And I think I'm sensitive to global issues, and I think there is a place to contribute to global issue things. But it seems to me that as an individual, if I can help one person, it's better than doing nothing. But if we collectively, or not as a substitute, but if collectively I work to help one person I find and help make a difference in their life, someone who is below my class level financially. And if we try to find a cause locally into which we can pour our heart and soul and really give a focus on that. Now, I've never thought that way. I've always thought globally. I live locally, think globally, but I'm just wondering, again, it's just a curiosity, maybe to toss it in the pile. There's a problem with it. On the other hand, it's have faith.
Well, there was an article in a Fire Messenger, which has always sort of struck me from years ago, and I don't know how you go about it, but sure we look at the old messenger and found out that church, but getting to your thing is where people with medical debt, we could do at this church, we buy this medical debt, it's like 10 cents on the dollar.
Yeah, I remember.
And eliminate some of the medical debt, because, I mean, I asked our son, when Kay had leukemia, how are you contributing this financially? And he said, there were 3 factors. One was my daughter-in-law healthcare, which she was under. 2, the state had a catastrophic fund. But the third was 4 diamonds. What those other 2 did not pick up was 4 diamonds. And while some stayed in the hospital with Kay, they gave their value. So like, his breakfast might cost $10, and him only paid 2, 4 diamonds. So, you know, I'm thinking 4 diamonds, we have such those are things that maybe we as a church look locally to help with getting rid of medical debt, which I know a friend of mine, her son, fortunately the fraternity did a fundraiser, shaved their heads, and he has a huge melanoma on the top of his head, and he's coming. That, you know, we could maybe look at pursuing that to do our normal outreach, but then if we want to look locally, medical debt is a killer for people financially. Your health insurance covers so much, and then you're and chemo meds, you can remember Karen Becker talking about how much it's
That's if you have insurance.
right.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on how our church shows the practice of peace, openness?
Paul talks about that the Jesus in the neighborhood, and that says all faith is local. That's what you're talking about.
Well, I think there's a place to think that way. I've never really thought quite so intently about it as the concept came through the 2 of you, and I thought, whoa, that is another way of thinking, and because I've tended so much to think globally. I look at the war, and I also feel so helpless about almost everything that's going on around me globally. But there are some, and I'm live in Lititz, but I think our church is here in Elizabethtown. So Elizabeth, who are the poor in Elizabethtown? What could be done to strengthen a sense of community and hospitality as patrons to their situation? I don't know enough about it, and I think the idea of looking at medical or whatever it would be, that doesn't solve the problem of our endowment issue. It could give us a mission to which we could become more passionate about, and maybe that would be good news to the poor, which I love that, picking up the issue of the gospel. we could be proclaiming the gospel in a radically new way if we did that. Just a thought. How done?
I'd like to piggyback on what David said, but my question has to do with my question has to do with the elephant in the room.
Okay.
The endowment and how we respond to that. And I didn't know what happens next week and the next week. I have an idea that at some point I'd like to put on the table.
Yeah.
And I don't know quite when the right time is for that.
Right, we are kind of wrapping up, and I did want to address that a little bit, a preview of next week, but I did see a couple other questions or comments. I didn't want to, if there's, yes.
I just wanted to say, we are involved in efforts. And we are involved individually, I don't know, as a church and some other social ministries. And we could up that. I don't know if we need to start something. But to see what's out there.
Yeah.
It means they're helping kids at school back, to get to that. And, we give them money to undocumented people who come in, and, we're helping them legally. And that's the sort of ingrown here. I don't know if anybody else really does that. But we are doing some things. We are working for peace. We put statements in the paper and spend thousands of dollars to do that, but it's, those are important things, but I think that doesn't mean we don't do anything globally. In large entities. I think probably we can have the most impact locally, but we still have a voice, we still have a vote. There still are very important things to do.
Well, good.
Or just putting it more in context of giving flesh to the bumper sticker, think globally, act locally, and how can we put flesh on the act locally? And envision new ways to do that. And Andy Murray song, one person at a time does it all, I mean, really comes hard if you take that seriously. Right? Act locally, what does that mean for our community, the setting, right? And in the neighborhood.
Well, we'll talk about next week, and I want to give a little. It was kind of interesting. So I went to district conference this week, and it's the first time I had ever attended it. So I was all in. So there was a Thursday Bible study that I attended. There was the Friday worship that I attended. Then yesterday I went. So I've never been there before, and I thought I should just participate in everything and get a feel for it. And it was kind of interesting. The Bible study was 1 Peter 3:8-9. And it was this, and what I got a sense of was this, look, here's how proper people behave kindly. And there was a lot of, I had heard in my being with this church, I've heard some angst with the district, things like that, but I never really like dove in and found out what it was. So I was listening to this concern that there would be conflict, and here's how we love each other. And that was Thursday night's Bible study, 1 Peter 3:8-9. And then at the Friday worship, there was another, I want to say, little coaching as to, hey, this is how, when things get tough, this is what we do. And then I got to the conference on Thursday, so I was really kind of anticipating maybe some fireworks. I wasn't sure. I'd heard different things and wasn't sure what was going to happen, because everybody's been well prepared to calm down everyone. And there really wasn't any of that there wasn't any of that. And everyone listened to the Bible study on what they're enacted appropriately. But I say that because I do want to make sure that we're having all voices heard in this. And there is a little bit of concern from the committee that we're not hearing all the voices on this. So next week we have this panel of stakeholders, and this needs to be hashed out from all directions. And we'll have that next week, and we will get questions out to you this week so that you can be prepared. But again, more discussion, more discernment, and we just ask that we hope we're creating an environment where all can speak up. And that's our wish from the committee. There's a little concern that maybe some folks are just not voicing or have questions and don't want to ask. So I'm prepping you all like they prepped us. That's okay. You know, we want to hear that. The committee really needs to hear that. So thank you so much. Thanks for what you did in those 3 weeks and then today as well. We'll be back here again, and I think we're going to do it again here in the fellowship hall next week.
There's a luncheon here next week.
Okay, Jason usually reminds me of those things. So we will probably be up in room 102. Yeah, we'll continue this. And it doesn't stop after these 6 weeks Money Talk series. This whole purpose of this was so that we're better informed to make tough decisions and be more knowledgeable. So thanks everybody for attending. I think they got the sign up sheet out after a few of you had signed in, so please sign in. And also to the chairs, if we could just put them on this rack over here, that would be helpful as well. Thank you all. No one ever chose.